Hi everyone. Thank you. Apologies for that slight technical hitch. Thank you so much for joining Planet Tracker on today's webinar, and where we're going to discuss our report Easy Unpickings. My name is Catherine Tubb and I run the Textiles programme here at Planet Tracker. And today we're really planning on discussing some of the opportunities and challenges in getting wet processors to transition to more sustainable practices and the financial risks if they don't, and with a particular focus on the role of investors and finance in this transition. Please, if you could submit any questions in the Q&A so we can get to those later as well. I'm delighted today to be joined in this discussion by two fantastic panelists. Ryan Gaines, who's the Director of Finance and Operations at the Apparel Impact Institute and has more than 10 years of experience in finance, including roles as an investment banking analyst, investment fund research analyst. And at AII, Ryan manages the blended capital research, financial planning and budgeting and operations, amongst other core activities. And also welcome to Bob Assenberg, who's the Fund Director of Good Fashion Fund, as well as the Managing Partner and Co-founder of Havent, an impact investment and strategic advisory firm for developing countries. He has over 20 years of experience in impact investments and a long track record in setting up and managing funds. So welcome both. And before going into the discussion, I just wanted to spend a few minutes going through some of our key conclusions from our report. And just as an introduction, for those of you not particularly familiar with Planet Tracker, we're a not-for-profit think tank launched in 2018, where we seek to align investor capital with planetary limits and really aim to build upon the growing recognition that the finance community is not yet accurately quantifying environmental risks and integrating environmental data into their valuations and decision-making. And our aim in the end is really to enable investors to place value on natural capital and therefore price that natural capital accordingly, and ultimately for them to make decisions based on those risks and opportunities. So we're very much trying to affect change through the financial markets. And at Planet Tracker, we aim to address these issues through 4 programs: oceans, food and land use, plastics and textiles. And we're very grateful to H&M and Lauders Foundations who fund our textiles work. And as we were preparing for this webinar, it was suggested that actually not everyone knows what wet processing is. And this is really a symptom of how far-reaching and opaque the textile supply chain is. It consists of thousands of independent companies in a complex network coordinated by textile orders from the brand owner or end retailer. And here we show one representation of it, but in reality, it's a pretty linear supply chain. And here each circle represents a key node or area of the supply chain. So you start with the raw materials, cotton or plastics, which are spun into fibres, weaved into fabrics, which are then dyed before being made into apparel, and then of course being sold through a brand or retailer. So it doesn't stop there, with recently large post-consumer markets growing, but currently most clothes at the end of their life still end up as landfill or being incinerated. And wet processing is the dyeing and finishing of the fabric. It's thought of as a tier 2 in the supply chain, with garment manufacturers generally being known as tier 1. And as such, it's one step removed from the brands and the retailers. And environmentally, it's one of the worst offending parts of the supply chain, dealing with high water, energy and chemical use and waste, as you'd perhaps expect. In fact, the recent report from AII and WRI sized GHG emissions from tier 2 as 52% of the whole supply chain, double that of raw materials extraction. In addition, it's mainly done in countries in Southeast Asia like China, India, Vietnam, and is heavily reliant on coal-based energy sources. And of course, these areas also have a higher water risk as measured by the WRI. And this is partly why at Planet Tracker, we have focused particularly on this part of the supply chain. And in our report, Easy Unpickings, we really wanted to focus on the return around simple practical improvements many wet processing facilities could make to their environmental impact, and at the same time lowering their operating costs. And the measures we focused on were the energy efficiency, but of course this has knock-on effects for water consumption as well. Example of measures included installing meters to detect leaks, improving insulation of pipes and tanks, heat recovery from hot water and reuse of cooling water, amongst others. Some of these require equipment improvement, and also training and education of personnel is an important part. And in our report, we wanted to specifically highlight the investment opportunity available to financial institutions to generate impressive investment returns while improving the environmental footprint of the manufacturing plants. And these impressive financial returns, such as 68% annualized return on investment and an IRR of 33% after 2 years, come hand in hand with a 10 to 15% improvement in energy and water use. As shown here, an initial average investment of almost $500,000 can lead to equivalent operational savings in just 14 months, which is a phenomenally quick return on investment. And of course, as this chart shows, they're not one-off, they're an ongoing and accumulating impact. But I guess the question part of what we want to discuss today is really, why haven't wet processors made this change already? And really, from our research, it came through a lack of access to an understanding of the finance that's available, which is compounded really on both sides, from the wet processors and of course the financial institutions and investors. We do see some other options which we want to discuss more today, and from investors seeing those opportunities perhaps through the debt markets in the forms of sustainability linked bonds or pooled bonds. But also we see a key role for the brands here to help facilitate and even fund these transitions. So thank you so much for that. And I think we'll just get into the conversation then, and the discussion around, particularly around financing, I guess. So let's turn first to Ryan. And, we in our report focus specifically on the low hanging fruit opportunities for just wet processes. But it's worth mentioning that AI, of course, also look at garment manufacturing, or T1. And Ryan, you were recently an author on the AIR report unlocking the $1 trillion fashion decarbonisation opportunity with Fashion for Good, and you really outlined the pathway to net zero for the apparel sector. It's a really fantastic report. So could you spend a couple of minutes summarising the key conclusions from that report and how you perhaps see these low-hanging fruit opportunities fitting in with your conclusions from there?
Yes, happy to. And first of all, thanks for having me on today, Catherine. I'm happy to be here, and I think this is a important topic, and it's good to get the word out. So the recent report that we released that you mentioned identified that 50% of the total carbon reduction to get to net zero by 2050 will come from existing solutions. Those are the ones that we already have the technology, we already know how to do it today. Things like renewable energy, scaling preferred materials, replacing coal with cleaner forms of thermal energy, and then energy efficiency specifically at tier 2 facilities, which is what we're talking about today. Then there's some newer technologies that are still under development that will get us the rest of the way there. Those are mainly the next generation of materials, and then also reducing the need for thermal energy entirely by switching from wet processing to dry processing. So those are still more early stage technologies that need some investment to scale up. But specifically for energy efficiency at tier 2 facilities, it has a very high financial ROI, which you've already mentioned, and also high environmental savings for relatively low investment. So it's immediately actionable, and we see it as the low-hanging fruit while we're working on all these other initiatives that we'll need to also deploy to get to net zero.
So in terms of the timing then, do you kind of see the first 5 to 10 years being taken up with the low-hanging fruit while we develop this new technology? What's the thinking in terms of that pathway to net zero?
Yeah, I think by 2030, ideally, we would have implemented energy efficiency at all tier 2 facilities, also switched over renewable electricity sources, completely phased out coal, and scaled up preferred materials like recycled polyester and organic cotton to 50% plus of the total apparel mix. So those all need to happen as quickly as possible. At the same time, there needs to still be the early stage investment in the next wave of technologies that we can then start deploying, in the next decade to get us all the way there.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, I guess, wet processing and how important that is to the overall picture, because I know we talk about it in our report, but I don't want to limit our discussion just to wet processing. But in terms of that part over the next 10 years, how do you see the role of that? You mentioned going to dry processing, but I guess in terms of perhaps the investment in wet processing initially.
Yeah, so you mentioned the statistic, 52% of the total emissions are coming just from the tier 2, which is the wet processing. And so that's where the biggest impact of the energy efficiency investments are going to be. We also think that currently most of the thermal energy at wet processing is coming from coal. And even though we don't have a perfect replacement today, switching to natural gas or biomass in the meantime can help cut emissions by more than half. But I think in the next 10 years, one of the highest priority areas is also finding a cleaner source of that thermal energy. So whether it's concentrated solar or hydrogen, there needs to be a switch, and that's a huge savings potential there, on top of the energy efficiency investments that we're discussing today.
And then we also talk a lot about water in some of the reports we've written. And I know that the data was given on energy efficiency, but it also comes hand in hand with water savings. So I know you're focusing a little bit more on water and chemical usage at AII. Do you want to perhaps just go into that a little bit and how you see that?
Absolutely, yeah. So the two do go hand in hand. It is, if you just target energy, you end up saving some water and chemicals use as well. So even with our energy focused program, you see water and chemical savings up to 10 to 15%. We also now have a new program that specifically targets chemicals reduction, and we'll add on a water reduction module in the future. So there's a few additional activities that you could do to save water and chemicals beyond the ones that are focused on energy. But at the end of the day, this is, recycling wastewater, helps you save all three. And so they often do go hand in hand.
Fantastic. And then Bob, perhaps you can talk a little bit about what you're doing with the Good Fashion Fund and how that is complementary perhaps to the work that AII are doing and the report that they put out.
Sure. No, firstly, thanks for having me here. Good to spread the word about investments in the sustainability of the fashion industry. So good to be here. Briefly on the Good Fashion Fund. It's a fund initiated by the Lourdes Foundation and the Fashion for Good. And basically with the idea to bring the industry more towards sustainability and circularity, with the idea to invest and finance manufacturers in countries in Asia, and we particularly look at Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam, to adopt and implement technologies that really make a difference. So we're looking, and that's maybe a slight difference in where we are complementary, I think, to Apparel Impact Institute. We're looking at somewhat bigger investments. So we're providing longer term finance, 1 million to up to 4.5 million, really with the idea to buy new machinery, state-of-the-art proven technology. So what we do in that respect is scaling up, I would say, accessibility to those machines and to that equipment for, I would call them, SME manufacturers. At the same time, what the fund is doing, because there's always, I think, if you want to make progress, on the one hand is accessibility for already existing proven impact technologies. At the same time, we also want to scale up new technologies. So that's also the part of the fund what we're doing, where we try to finance the manufacturers that are willing to adopt and basically be the first takers of new technology that can really then be scaled up and be more affordable for other manufacturers at a later stage. So in that sense, we are complementary. We're not looking directly at the low-hanging fruit. We're looking at long-term investments with somewhat longer payback period, as well as what is it, the 14-month that has been mentioned in your report. And also, I think the level of reduction or savings that we do see is then also higher. So that will be more in the range, and we're looking at least for most of the machinery, a range of 50% or more. So in that sense, it is in addition to what they're doing, but the implementation itself requires money and also knowledge, and as at least awareness of what is around. And that's what we try to do with the fund: bring the awareness, but also bring the finance in order to adopt these technologies and become more sustainable towards circularity, because that's in the end what we want.
Are there any projects you're particularly excited about that you can talk a bit more about? I know I like to have real world examples for people who might not know about it.
Yeah, no, I can tell you a little bit more what we do finance. I think it is a lot of it, and in that respect, I can completely echo what you're saying in your report as well. I think the wet processing is an area where there's a lot to be gained. And we as a fund, we look at 5 goods, as we call them, but they're quite similar to AII as well. It's about energy, it's about water, it's materials, chemicals. It's about lives. We look at the social elements as well, and it's also about economy, because I think in the end, investments do come with environmental benefits, and I think they're interlinked, water and energy, but also it has financial benefit as well, because in the longer term, environmental benefit means less water uses, less usage of materials and chemicals, so it has a financial benefit, and that's what makes it really important, I think, to to the manufacturers, but that's also something to demonstrate, I think, to the broader sector, to see that there is a benefit which really makes sense, not just from an environmental point of view, but also from a finance point of view. So what we're looking at in terms of projects, it's a bigger range. So we're looking at dyeing. You see a lot of it, what we do is really in the tier 2. It's about dyeing, it's about finishing, it's about washing, wastewater treatment. But on the other hand, what we also look at, which is an interesting element, is the whole recycling element. So in that sense, I think also looking, and that can be waste recycling, of course, water recycling, but it can be waste recycling in different ways. And I think that's really where the industry should be going, and which we also see right now is that banks are not really knowledgeable, I would say, or not willing at this stage to finance this. And that we also see as a role that we have to play to demonstrate that this actually could work, both from a social, because we also really look at the social element, environmental, but as well on the financial side. So the project that we're looking at right now, and they're particularly in India and Bangladesh, where we're focusing on right now, they go along those lines. So it's more on the wet processing, wastewater treatment, and recycling. Those are the areas that we look at.
Fantastic. And then that probably leads us into talking a little bit about the financing and investment side, and I think both the report AII put out about, we've talked a little bit about how important financing is. And as you say, there are operation improvements that can come in line with environmental improvements. And I think proving that shows a huge opportunity for investors. We found in our work that giving investors an opportunity is as important as highlighting the risks. And, I think generally we understand that this financing approach is going to be pretty multifaceted in terms of, efforts from brands and investors and manufacturers. So I guess, Ryan, what are the investment vehicles that currently exist and perhaps need to exist in order to deploy more capital into the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, capital is definitely a big obstacle. Some of the facilities that we work with, don't end up going through with the investment because of access to capital. And, debt makes sense for this. It's a pretty quick payback period and very high ROI. So the facility would actually be able to keep most of those savings if they were able to access low interest rate debt. But debt's often already very high at the facilities, or they're hesitant to take on debt unless they're confident that they're going to be expanding their volume and turnover. If they're expanding, something like the loans that Bob does with Good Fashion Fund makes sense. But for a really short-term energy efficiency investment with their current operations, debt doesn't always make the most sense. On the other hand, investors don't necessarily need to make a long-term equity investment in a manufacturing facility overseas in order to realize these benefits. So those two traditional structures don't necessarily make sense here. So we're actually exploring some royalty type structures where investors receive a payback that's proportional to the energy savings of the facility. So they're taking on some of the risk that the savings are realized, but can also get a high return and a quick payback period compared to what they might see with equity or debt traditionally.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I guess, is there much appetite for that? Have you seen investors getting excited by that kind of opportunity, or are you still in the exploration stage?
Yeah, so I think investors are excited about the potential. It's definitely attractive ROI, and a lot of the investors that we're talking to have a lot of capital that they've committed to put into ESG investments, but don't actually have enough attractive investment opportunities. So this helps fill that need. One obstacle we're finding to scaling is that these are relatively low dollar investments for each facility. So it's a pretty high underwriting and diligencing cost and hurdle to get past just to do one of these investments. So, I think what may needs to happen in order to make this work is some sort of an aggregation of these types of opportunities where the investor is, buying a bundle of many different facilities instead of doing them one off.
Yeah, we suggested some kind of pooled investment vehicle and thinking it exactly along those kind of lines, but I like the royalty payback idea. And how do you, In terms of communicating these with investors, is it generally the finance speaking? Is that what's winning them over in terms of the high ROIs and the quick payback period, or is it more on the ESG, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's both. We're definitely specifically talking to groups that are seeking the ESG factors. That's what gets them interested in the first place. But then once you've kind of checked the box, or at least validated the ESG opportunity, then it really does come down to the risk reward of the investment on its own merit. So truly impact investors that are weighing both fairly equally.
And Bob, do you see similar or slightly different barriers when you're attracting the investment into the good fashion fund? I guess the sizes of the investments are bigger.
Yeah.
But is there anything else on that?
Well, I think in itself, it's to attract. Just also to be clear, we're I think the only or the first fund in the world basically to focus particularly on financing manufacturers for this kind of equipment. So it tells you there's not a lot going on in that respect, and so there must be hurdles. Otherwise, people would be stepping in. And I think some of the elements Ryan already mentioned. It's sometimes a small amount, so it might be difficult to get into. So pooling is definitely good. I think that could work, particularly if you would standardize directly. Yeah, so you have to make the process simple, straightforward, so everyone understands what they're doing. Then that could be working. But at the same time, I think in terms of making investments, anyway, royalty or performance-linked investments, that is something that could actually be quite interesting going forward. So I see those as elements that could potentially work. I think in the longer term, if you really want to support, and that's really in the longer term, if you want to support those manufacturers, it's important also to engage the local financial sector. Because I think what we need to do from an international point of view is really to demonstrate that this can be done. And it makes sense financially, and it makes sense from an environmental and social point of view. But ultimately, it would be much better for the local manufacturers if they could actually step to their local bank that they're already working with. And there, I think that's a role that we have to play. And that's a role that we also would like to play in terms of having that demonstration effect. Because typically what you do see in financing, it's shorter term, so it's working capital related. Then particularly I think on the SME manufacturers, and I think specifically for this sector, which is rather fragmented compared to other sectors, it is shorter term financing. We just have to make a case and demonstrate the case that these longer term investments, they make sense financially. And that I think is one of the big hurdles. People don't understand this market completely, because it's not your typical value chain where you just have a brand, their own facilities, and then sell them. It's really basically having manufacturers in between, working for many basically brands, which makes it much more difficult and less transparent for everyone. So that I think is also an obstacle towards financing the industry.
Yeah, and I think that leads nicely into the role of the brands, because I think we have had many discussions about the role of the brands in this transition, and it feels like it's a constant push-pull between the suppliers and the brands, and the brands kind of making certain demands around sustainability, and then the manufacturers having to fulfill them, but not necessarily being given the long-term support by the brands. And I'm sure that's a huge generalization, and I'm sure there are many brands doing good things and brands doing bad things equally, but it does kind of bring in this question that their role, I mean, they could be a real conduit, right, in the change. And so I guess for you two, how much, Ryan, because I know originally brands tend to contact you and you go in to scope out manufacturing facilities, but how much do you find brands are involved with the process beyond that? Are they actively involved in the financing as much as the kind of the engagement?
Right. No, that's the key issue is, we do work with brands, and they're, eager to see these changes implemented, and they help fund the initial feasibility assessment at the facility. But then most of the cost, 95% of the total cost, is actually in making the capital equipment upgrades. And that's where the brands are less involved. Honestly, I don't know if it's the brands that really should be funding those financial investments. It's not necessarily in their wheelhouse. And each facility serves multiple brands at once. So a single brand, wouldn't necessarily make sense for them to fund that as a financial investment. I think where the brands could really make a huge difference is in helping provide longer term guarantees to the facility. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that investors get hung up on, is that the industry operates just on short-term purchase orders, and it's hard to give a long-term investment to a facility when you don't know if the volume's going to be there, even a year or two from now. And so to the extent that a brand can give even just a 2 or 3 year guarantee of volume to a facility that agrees to make these efficiency upgrades or other sustainability upgrades, would completely unlock financing from the investor community, so that the brands wouldn't necessarily need to take on that full burden themselves.
Yeah, that's what we hear a lot as well, that having those longer term contracts would be really helpful when securing the financing. Bob, do you agree in terms of the brands? Would you like to see the brands more actively involved in the financing, or?
Well, I think an important element is what Ryan is saying. I think it's particularly if you go for long-term investment, but you have short-term commitments, it's a tough way actually to make it happen. So I do agree on that side. I think still, and I must say, new initiatives, of course, are coming up. I think particularly in the last couple of months, you see a lot of brands moving towards more sustainability. I think in order to make it happen, also to make it happen for the manufacturing, you mentioned the pooling before. It's not so much pooling of investment, but it's also pooling of sort of the strategy, and try to sort of work for those brands to work together. Because from a manufacturer point of view, and I know that a lot of manufacturers who are intrinsically basically motivated to become more sustainable, but it's basically the push from the brands is difficult, because the one might be looking at energy efficiency, the other might be looking at water. So it's very difficult basically to weigh for a manufacturer how to do it, and have balancing all of these requests at the same time, and at the same time also doing your own business. So I think a pooling there and a stronger commitment on behalf of a number of brands, particularly if they would, for instance, jointly be off-takers from a certain supplier and then build that up. I think that could definitely work. Another element which I think is important, but that's also what we look at as a fund, is as I mentioned, the social element. And I think that's also where there can be a strong commitment on behalf of the brands, and that is in everyone's interest in that respect. It's of course about safety, it's about better working conditions. But at the same time, I think with longer term commitments, also what it goes with is basically more safety on the financial side as well. Because in the end, I think also in terms of financial pay for people, that's what you need to look at as well. So that is also not picking up, the whole discussion that we do have on living wages and so on. It's difficult if one brand by itself is actually targeting a supplier who has to work with a lot of others as well. If you would pool efforts here, I think on top of the sort of environmental and financial issues, you could also up on those social issues, which have a financial impact. But I think that is also where you really make impact. So it's a long answer to your question. Do you think that brands should play a role? Yes, and I think they're doing. But I think it's good to have it targeted and also have a joint effort. I think that's the way it would work best in the end. Although they're competitors, but I think some of these elements can still work for the sector as such, not so much brand linked.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing we were thinking was, as a brand, is there a role? A couple of them have released kind of sustainability linked bonds recently, and they've specifically mentioned looking at their supply chains. So I was wondering if you'd seen any of the money kind of trickle down from that action, or if that's being. Because again, we think something like that with a pooled investment vehicle, pooled sustainability linked bonds, could be an interesting way to access debt markets, and it would involve collaboration amongst the brands, which is the whole issue. But
well, I think in itself that would be a really good example of how you can pool and how you can actually get money together with the same aim in that respect. But then you need to standardize. Firstly, I think you need to demonstrate how it works, and it's probably good to standardize, because any bond that you do have, typically the sourcing of the deals must be relatively easy. It's just pooling deals that can be done. So I think it's important to get that up front, get that right. And then I think that could really be an angle to do it, because then you have targeted support to manufacturers to do certain things, which of course is done in the bonds. So yes, I do think in the longer term, I think where it stands right now, it's showing that it can be done. And I think with AI, what they're doing, and also spread the word in that respect. So I think if you read this report, and you spread the word and you see that you have so much benefit, this ROI, this payback period of whatever 14 months, why shouldn't you do it? And I think that is actually what should be known, because once you have done that, then you really generate much more deal flow on that side. And we think the same with our investments. I think the investments that you can do that is somewhat bigger. I think also the benefits that you do have, both from a social and environmental side, are so huge that should really attract more funding.
One of the things you did just mention and I picked up on was in terms of measuring, because I think that's still, I think we find in the space, the measurement of the environmental and social impacts is still quite a hard thing to do. There's a lot of data out there that's kind of been proved to be wrong and things like that. But I guess, I mean, how do you guys measure when you're thinking about the impact of your projects? What are you measuring? Are you measuring in terms of environmental or social, or both? So how do you measure impact is, sorry, the short question to my rambling.
On our side, on a facility by facility basis with each of the programs that we do, we measure the water savings, energy savings, chemical savings, the associated greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the financial impacts. We don't have a standardized way necessarily to measure the social impact, but we do track all of those other more environmental metrics and use that internally to inform additional programming. We help report that back to the brands. I think we could probably do a better job of reporting it externally for public consumption. I think that's an area that we're moving into to kind of make all that data widely available. And I think this case study with Planet Tracker is a step in that direction, where we're making a lot of this data from certain cohorts available.
Yes, thank you for that. And when you go into the facilities, they generally have the measuring set up. Is that something? I know it sounds a weird question, but do you even just have to set that up in the first place, measure the before and after? Is that as you go into the facilities?
Yes, so they have it set up. They can measure, at a macro level, how much energy is the facility consuming, how much steam energy, oil, electricity. They can see that for the entire facility. One thing that we do is put sensors and measuring technology on individual parts of the process, so that you can start to identify where the big, consumers of energy and water and chemicals are at a process level, and that helps inform where you make the interventions. But they do have good tracking at the facility level, which is mostly where we measure the ultimate impact. Is, did the total energy use of the facility decline?
And I guess the same question to you, Bob, as well. And what are you looking to measure in terms of your impact when you go in with your fund?
Yeah, I think firstly we start with quite a strict, or at least elaborative sort of E&S framework, basically how we do things and what we would like to measure. I think on top of that, where we do have a fund as a fund is the benefit we do have, as we call it, a development evaluator, which is basically a partnership between Global Cut and Adelphi, helping us out to improve, to learn from what we basically measure, and with every deal that we do, and also to demonstrate how we can actually jointly with the potential investees, how we can make it better. So how can we actually really measure, how can we learn from it and apply it to the next deal? So it's a continuous learning process from our side. But what we do right now in that respect, and on learning and also on measuring, we measure just like the same thing as Ryan just mentioned. We do that. We do the water savings, energy savings, material saving, chemicals, because that's also, we do a baseline reporting once we start making an investment, and we do on a regular basis. And most of the cases, it's already there. Sometimes we need to apply a little bit more, but most of the cases, they do already measuring, but we can do it then directly linked towards the investments we do. On top of that, we look at the HIC index with the SAC as a sort of an entry point to see where they stand on all of those elements that are important to ourselves. And I think in our due diligence, because we're an impact fund, we're working closely with environmental but also social experts. So we make a plan based on the assessment where we make an environmental social action plan, which is part of the loan agreement. So it's not a voluntary measure. It's something which, if you don't comply, it could lead, in the worst case, even to an event of default. But really with the idea, this is a joint effort between ourselves and also, I think, the manufacturer, and in our case, the investee, to make improvements. And particularly, I think, on the social side, that is something where we have a plan where things can be taken up. But as we have a long-term view, the real benefit of our fund is it should not be done. It's not just the low-hanging fruit on the social side, but we really have the ability as well to, for some cases, to take 2 to 3 years to really build up knowledge, build up things within those particular facilities. So I think there are a couple of things that we do, and we're planning to demonstrate our effects in a broader sense. So really make it more public, and that's also in that respect we're also working jointly with the development evaluator how to do that most efficiently and effectively.
And then I guess, Ryan, like a lot of the stuff at AII has been through the pilot phase, just talking about scaling up, and we've kind of touched on the idea of scaling up these technologies. So how do you go about that process, and that process of scaling up? What does it look like in terms of investment and in terms of process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's the right question. We think about it a lot. On the margins, there's still new pilots for proving that it works in a new country, or even outside of wet processing, even outside of apparel, to be honest. But the core program in wet processing energy efficiency is very proven. It's been successful for many years. Almost every facility realizes savings, and it really is time to scale a program that is working, and that's kind of what we think about all the time. So whether it's finding more brands to help recruit to get to actually get to the facilities and get them to commit to doing the program, funding that initial investment from the brands and philanthropy. I think that is a big piece of the scale equation. But what we've been talking about today, how you unlock financing for it, I think would move the needle tremendously if there was capital available to these facilities to access to make these improvements. That is really a barrier to scale. So it's at this point it's less about proving that it works and more about finding the capital to reach 10x, 100x the number of facilities that we have already.
And how about you, Bob, in terms of scaling up? In terms of the process, what are you seeing?
Yeah, no, I think what part of what we do is related to scaling up of technologies. But we use the same angle there. We finance the manufacturers. So basically, I would call it the sort of the triangle, where we look with manufacturers, technology provider, and often they're new technology providers, so more disruptive technology providers, as well as the brands, to jointly to look at a solution where a particular manufacturer could actually start adopting and implementing new technology. And that technology, I do agree, a lot of it has been proven, but we do things, particularly in dyeing. We look at waterless dyeing, for instance. We look at CO2 dyeing. These kind of things we look at. And I think you need a manufacturer to be willing and have the ability, and also to having the bandwidth to implement that. And it's about finance. It's about willingness, I think, in the end, and giving it the time to do it. I think the scaling of these kind of things are really important for the industry, because in the longer term, there's so much happening, I think, in terms of disruptive technologies. And it's a mixture. So some of it are being used internally. So you see a lot of these bigger manufacturers even also doing it themselves, their own R&D. Some of it is basically existing, already well-known technology providers that start adding on through their local through their R&D, adding on new technologies that are really different. And some of that are like, for instance, the one that we're working with Fashion for Good, the skating program, for instance. Some of them also in that sense, they're really new. They're people sometimes out of the apparel industry coming with a great idea and try to implement it, and just trying to find a network, being brands and manufacturers and the finance, which are we in this case, in order to make it all happen. But to be honest, it's not an easy process, because also new technologies in the apparel industry, there are not that many around that are easily successful. So it is tough, but it's definitely something which I think in the longer term is really important, because if you look at the industry, if you look at the apparel industry, in terms of what has changed in the whole process and the whole technology, it's not that different from so many years, decades ago. And if you look at other industries, they completely changed. So I think there's still a lot to be done in the apparel industry there.
Mm. And then I would agree with you completely. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see over the next year. It always reminds me a little bit of farming. You know, in farming, there's a lot of new technologies going on, but ultimately it's kind of the same as it was many years ago. Yeah. I guess in terms of thinking about your kind of focuses for, you know, existing technology improvement and new technologies, which area do you think has potential to make the most impact, Ryan? I don't know if there's in the supply chain, I know we've talked about wet processing as having an impact. Is there any other part of the supply chain that you think needs particular focus on?
Yes, so going to existing and new technologies, I think just moving to renewable electricity across all the tiers of the supply chain is going to have the biggest, you know, absolute value of emission savings. It's proven technology. It works in most of the regions where apparel manufacturing happens, and financing is for the most part available. So we're starting to see that shift, and hopefully it accelerates in the coming years, that we can put rooftop solar and utility scale solar off-site for all of these facilities. And then what really needs to happen next in order to, you know, kind of complete this transition is a renewable form of thermal energy, which traditional renewable solar panels don't quite get us there yet. There's some promising technology with more concentrated solar that can help replace the thermal need in the wet processing facility. And that's an area that we're starting to look into pretty heavily to figure out how to scale coal out as quickly as possible.
And very topical, of course, with COP and India, especially. So,
yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you say that there is so much. I think people are starting to be aware of that fact, and I think we're starting to see even from the brands realizing that's a quick win for them. So it might be interesting if we see the brands kind of using their weight when it comes to that factor. And Bob, is it for you guys? Is there anything that you see that you're particularly excited about beyond perhaps wet processing?
No, I agree. I think in terms of energy, there's renewable energy, there's a lot to be done, but I think that is really proven. So I would assume, and I know that new facilities are being set up, but there should, in the longer term, there should be also for the local banks, this should be something which is feasible from their point of view, because it really works. They have seen it before. So the benefit, I think, of renewable energy versus others is that it has been really applied in other industries. They've seen that it does work. So I think it should be, hopefully it should be easier to get that financing. Yeah, from our side, I think wet processing is something we looked at. We're in that sense quite open in what we can do. I also mentioned the recycling bit, which I think is, we're looking at mechanical. Of course, chemical recycling is still a little bit further ahead in that sense, how advanced it is. But I think the mechanical plus recycling, let's put it that way, I see that as a way, because in the end it integrates the whole process. So how do you design things, and how does it come back again in sort of cotton, or that can be used again in terms of cotton, that can be reused again. I think in that sense, I'm really also enthusiastic about that. And for us, I think the new initiatives that are taking on, and that's what I like also about of course, like a Fashion for Good is also another man in terms of transparency, what is happening there, this whole resale. I think there are a lot of things to that can be done, and some of them are consumer related, I think, and others are really more in the manufacturing process related. And I think on that side, I think there's so much to do, and I think really it's about what we do. It's about helping those investees, but it's also working together with manufacturers association, spreading the word. I think that's really important. So the role that we should have, I think, generally is not just help the companies that we work with, but also facilitate them actually in terms of getting to understand what is happening and creating that awareness. I think that is really important, because I think a lot of these manufacturers, in terms of things that can be done, they're often just not aware of it. And I think that's also a role that we should be playing. And I think if we can link it together with them, as with AII or with ourselves, and we can link it but also the financing package on top of that, then it's really, it feels like it's like a road. It's no longer a bumpy road, you know, it's more like a smooth road that you can take. And actually then it's a logical next step to finance it as well.
I think the education and training aspect is really important. That came across to me when we initially talked to you, Ryan, about how much it's not just about what you do, it's about giving people the tools to keep doing, like that education and training. So in terms of your investment, do you split them up in terms of where it is? Is there like a percentage split in terms of investment into education or training versus capital? Ryan, I don't know in terms of the AII work, if there are rough percentages you can give. If not, that's fine.
Well, so we don't fund at this point. We don't fund the capital piece of it at all. So in a sense, it's all education and training, because we'll go into the facility and do a feasibility assessment and train them and give them the tools to make the investment themselves. So on a facility level, there's that education and training component to it. But then I think also to Bob's point is, the broader industry and the manufacturing groups and the brands, and making those tools publicly available where other facilities and other brands that we're not necessarily even engaged with could go ahead and scale and implement these solutions. And that's I think a smaller part of our work so far, but something that we're keen to scale up and grow and make more publicly available. And one other area that I'll add that's a focus for us next year is providing education and training actually on the finance side. So helping the manufacturing facilities understand what financing options are available to them, what's attractive, what makes sense, what the payback periods look like. So we're creating a whole module and tools around that we can help inform the facilities and anyone else who's interested. Yeah,
sounds great. So I guess if we think about wrapping up, but Ryan, what are the ambitions for AII over the next 5 years, and where are you going to see the program? You mentioned training, but I don't know if there's anything else that you want to plug here.
I think, doing whatever it takes to scale energy efficiency. So whether that's handing it off to industry and market to take forward, that would be amazing. I suspect there'll still be a large role for us in helping it reach scale. But that's definitely top of mind. And then expanding into these new areas, renewable energy, renewable thermal, phasing out coal, sustainable materials, helping unlock financing, kind of moving to those next phase of the work to meet the science-based targets for 2030 and beyond.
And how about yourself, Bob?
Yeah, no, I think for us, this first fund, we see it as a first fund or more to come in that respect. So we'd like to deploy it here. And then for us, the demonstration effect would be that we demonstrate to investors and also local financial sector that investing in this kind of equipment and towards circularity really makes sense. So that is something that we're enthusiastic about going forward. I think also an important element, and Ryan just touched upon sort of financial education. Some of these, and particularly if you look at countries like Bangladesh, for instance, there's so many of these SMEs that are maybe willing, but just not capable, or in that respect, to make them, I call it investment ready. I think there's another angle to be taken there as well, because I think in order for the financial sector and investors to step in, there need to be a certain level of not just on the E&S side, but also in terms of operation, reporting, governance. I think that is the kind of level that you're looking at in order to become really attractive. So that would be for ourselves to partner with organizations also on that side to see how you could make them investment ready, because then I think the pool of potential manufacturers would become much higher. So Yeah, we have many plans. I think we just the first one is actually to make this fund a good success, of course, and then follow up on it. But I think there's a lot to do, because I think the availability of capital or finance is still a big hurdle. So the many angles actually to tackle that, and that's what we try to do with the fund.
That ties in nicely with our second report in what I like to call the trilogy on wet processing that we published, which was Threadbare Data, and it looked at the financial disclosure around environmental disclosure, I guess, for 293 wet processors.
Yeah.
Listed equities in the sector. So it's obviously not the whole universe, because it's far more than that. And as you say, it's just not great. I mean, it's not great amongst the brands to a certain degree, and it's much worse amongst wet processors. So you're right, I think having that trickle down effect as people are starting to focus more on the environmental and social impacts of reaching further down the supply chain is going to be key. We don't have any questions, but I might just give a minute in case anyone wants to write a question in the question box. Please feel free. Otherwise, we'll just say thank you very much to Bob and Ryan, and if anyone has any questions about our reports or the other work that we're doing at Planet Tracker, please feel free to contact me. We'd love to hear from you. Oh, hang on, the questions popped up. How exciting. Will the webinar be recorded and put on YouTube? Yes, it's being recorded, so we'll make sure it gets to everyone. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Take care.